Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Anthony Marra to discuss his new novel, Mercury Pictures Presents, a tour de force by a novelist whose work the Washington Post calls a flash in the heavens that makes you look up and believe in miracles. Anthony Marra is the New York Times bestselling author of The Czar of Love and Techno and A Constellation of Vital Phenomena, longlisted for the National Book Award and winner of the National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Prize, as well as the Anisfield Wolf Book Award in Fiction. To moderate this evening's conversation, we're joined by Celeste Ng, the #1 New York Times bestselling author of Everything I Never Told You and Little Fires Everywhere. Her third novel, Our Missing Hearts, will be published in October of this year, and we can't wait. Ng is the recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Guggenheim Foundation, and her work has been published in over 30 languages. Remember that throughout this evening's broadcast, you can post questions in the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and we thank you for ordering your copy of Mercury Pictures Presents from Books and Books and supporting indie bookstores. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Hello, and welcome.
Hello, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting us here, and thank you to all of you for coming. Hi, Tony.
Hey, how are you? Thank you. Huge thank you to Books and Books for hosting us. Thank you so much, Celeste, for being in conversation, and thank you all for tuning in tonight. This is the first leg of my book tour, and there's nobody I would rather be in conversation with than you, Celeste. So thank you so much for agreeing to chat books with me.
No, I'm thrilled to, not only because you are one of my favorite writers, but because you are just a lovely person. And I feel like our books, as I was saying earlier, I feel like our books kind of grew up next to each other. Can I tell people how we became friends?
Please.
So Tony and I was like, how did we become friends? It was through our work.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was doing a reading at Politics and Prose in DC, I think it was, and I picked up Constellation off of the front table just while I was waiting. I was like lurking, trying to not be conspicuous, and I was hooked from the first sentence. I took the book home and I read it, and then I remember just really being struck and going, damn, this guy really knows how to write. And then at some point you came to one of my book events and we chatted and became mutual fans of each other. Am I remembering this right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly it.
Yeah. And then you moved to Cambridge. And so we started having writing dates because I think we were both sort of stalled on our projects. And so our books
sort of mutually assured accountability.
Yeah, exactly. Which is, I feel like, a thing that writers have to do sometimes to get themselves going on the page. So I'm so thrilled that this book is finally out in the world, and I cannot wait to talk to you about it. So let's do it. So tell us, first of all, about the seeds of the book. What parts of it came to you first? What kind of inspired you to start writing it?
Yeah. So I began thinking of this book. Well, I guess maybe I'll first just set the wider stage. So Frank Lloyd Wright once said that if you tip the world on its side, all the loose pieces will land in Los Angeles. And this was never more true than it was in the 1930s and 40s, when you had thousands of refugees and emigres fleeing the war in Europe and arriving in LA. And this novel sort of explores that community, particularly through the lens of this down market B-movie studio called Mercury Pictures, and our sort of central focal point for experiencing this is a character named Maria Lagana, who works as this sort of junior producer at Mercury, and she's this very, very irreverent, tough-minded, sort of unflappable producer. I sort of modeled her on Rosalind Russell's character in His Girl Friday. Only,
Oh, I didn't know that.
yeah, it's one of my all-time favorite movies. And
Yeah, I love that movie.
yeah, and just like the back and forth that she has with Cary Grant, and just kind of the endlessly witty repartee that they have. I feel like I really tried to funnel that as much as I could into this book. And so that's sort of the bigger stage, I guess. And I first came to this project shortly after I finished Constellation, and I think while right before Tsar came out. At that point, I had written 2 books set in the former Soviet Union, and I was ready to come in from the cold. And I used to live in LA, and my wife is from there. And this period in Los Angeles history where you had this kind of incredible cultural transfusion had always really appealed to me. And so I was kicking around this idea of this book set in LA during this period. And at the same time, I was also thinking about doing something set in southern Italy, where my dad's family originally is from. And I couldn't really decide. I was going back and forth. And eventually I took a trip to this island called Lipari, which is just off the coast of Sicily. It's where my great-grandmother's family is from. And
do you speak Italian?
No. I mean, so I studied Italian, and I took 4 semesters of it, but I did so poorly in one that it was a repeat. So no, I don't. But yeah, on like one of our last days there, we saw this plaque that commemorated the various exiles whom Mussolini's regime had sentenced to this, sort of island paradise. And it occurred to me that this story of exile on 2 separate ends of the earth might be a way of approaching this book, and that rather than trying to decide between 2 novels, they might sort of be halves of the same book that I could kind of fold together.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, so the first section of the book is called Sunny Siberia, and there's something that one of the many exiles that works at Mercury Pictures says to another one. She's "Welcome to Sunny Siberia." And for a while, that was one of the working titles, right?
It was. So actually, I was having a really tough time with this. Probably right around our library writing date, recovery group or whatever you want to call it.
And Writers Anonymous kind of a thing. Yeah,
exactly. And so Cappy, my wife, actually got one of her friends to paint a sign that had Sunny Siberia on it, which I can actually show.
We should have a field trip and see the sign.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. Wait, has that just been hanging over your desk all this time? Like you just look at it when you're feeling stuck, you just look up and see like Sunny Siberia?
Yeah, I mean, it's very bright. It's a lovely lovely, yeah.
So tell us where that term came from. It's talked about in the novel, so people who read the novel will see. But tell us a little bit about that and why it spoke to you.
Yeah, so a number of these European exiles who landed in LA sort of saw Los Angeles as this very culturally desolate place that they weren't necessarily thrilled to be there, and it evoked sort of very strong, even perhaps more a greater sense of homesickness than had they landed elsewhere in Europe. And a number of them took to calling it Sunny Siberia, and there was something about that idea of Los Angeles, which to me, sort of evokes this land of plenty, as being this sort of sunny Siberia that I always loved. And I guess thinking of southern Italy and this particular island that we were visiting, the idea that the exiles, the Italian exiles who were sent there, might have also seen it as a sunny Siberia had appealed to me.
Yeah. And exile, I think, is one of the big themes of the book, sort of what it means to be taken away from your home country, or what it means to have had to leave it and not be sure that you're able to return. What is it that drew you to this topic?
I think it's. I think that in general, I've always been. I don't know. I think I've always been drawn to outsiders. In general, I think that that writers often feel like outsiders in some way. I think that part of the nature of the profession is you're kind of slightly on the margins. You're in the corner of any.
We're in the corner of the party,
Yeah.
watching and taking notes.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think that that sort of the idea of outsiders in general has been something that I've been interested in sort of in all of my work. Like thinking back to Constellation, where you have this sort of group of people who've been tossed together on on the grounds of this hospital in a city in Chechnya. Here you sort of have similar dynamics, only on a backlot in Hollywood. There's something about like that idea of social orders getting turned upside down, and what sort of new configurations of relationships, of power, of dreams and sorrow emerge from that kind of discombobulated, topsy-turvy world.
Yeah, there's something about it sort of being a transitory space, or almost kind of liminal in-between space. It reminds me a little bit of Casablanca, to talk about films of the era, of all these people who have been thrown into this space, who don't necessarily live there. They aren't sure if they're going to stay. They've kind of stayed, and figuring out sort of what their relationship to this place is.
Yeah, and also like I guess that kind of makes me think of of the topic of miniatures, and I know that you are an old hand in the miniature game, and right outside of Maria's office, there's this miniature of Mercury Pictures of the backlot itself, and that was sort of how I came to see this novel, and I think maybe how I think of most projects that I work on in general as sort of these spaces that can contain all of these different lives and stories that are kind of running into each other and colliding and sort of creating all of these interesting sparks.
Yeah, and the movie lot is the perfect setting for that sort of thing too, because in a sense, in the movie lot, everyone's playing a different role. You're assuming a different sort of persona than you might ordinarily have had. And there's this sort of artifice, there's this sort of fakeness to it. And that's something that the book plays with so much as well. There's a miniaturist, there's at one point a replica of Berlin, right, that's being built out in the desert. Mm-hmm. That's not a question. I guess that's just, an observation.
Yeah, I think that I don't know, that I'm curious to hear what you think in terms of, like, do you find that there are a couple of big ideas in your work that you keep returning to? Yeah, it's like I kind of think that we're kind of you're sort of almost like dealt the cards you're dealt, and you spend, in each book you reshuffle them in different ways, but you are continually kind of looking at the same ideas, and I think that sort of like artifice and just how difficult it is to get at the truth of kind of anything is something that has always appealed to me, and is something that I think, like, most of the characters struggle with to some degree. There's Maria's mother at one point has this line where Maria, they have this very complicated relationship, and at one point Maria says that she really wants to understand her mother, and her mother thinks how ridiculous this is, because in her mind, intimacy is not a threshold of revelation, but a sort of acceptance of ignorance, and kind of being willing to be bewildered by another person is kind of her conception of what intimacy and what love really is. And so I think that interplay between how much we ever know anybody else is something that certainly plays out throughout the book, both in terms of these very intimate spaces of relationships, but then also on these much broader sort of Hollywood setting.
Yeah, there's a sort of I feel like there's almost sort of like a cosmic justice sort of sense in your books, this one included, of these resonances of people coming back to make connections or make things right, or even just offer sort of a moment of emotional sort of cleansing, or, you know, these small moments in which lives kind of overlap with each other. Feels like it's one of the cards that you've got in your deck as well.
Yeah, it's, I mean, so like, and I know that we've had conversations over the years. We're not going to name names, but one of the things that I always love, like when reading a novel, is that sense of that, like, the author knows what they're doing, and that it's all going someplace, and that there's a payoff, and that the characters that you've fallen in love with and followed, around for X number of pages, that there is kind of like a point to all of it. And I think that those little grace notes, in which, a minor character from page 15, who is, I don't know, is missing his keys, finds it, on page 200, like those little, very delicate notes that sort of stitch everything together, have always really appealed to me.
Well, it goes back to the thing you were talking about before, about thinking of the book almost as sort of a miniature setting. There's the sense that as the author, you can see the whole sweep of what's going on. And maybe some of those characters in there are only aware of their search for the missing keys. But you as the author can look at them, and you can look somewhere else, and then you can zoom back to them. And there's a real, I feel like as a reader, I love that sense, again, that I'm taken in hand by a writer who's going to sort of bring me from place to place and show me what it is that I need to know. I think one of the things that makes that happen is that this book is just so cinematically rendered, and I mean that in the best possible way, that it feels so vivid, whether you're in this Italian prison colony, whether you're on the back lot, whether you're in the boardroom or show trials of the the kind of McCarthy era, pre-McCarthy era, I guess. I know that you did a lot of research about this. Can you tell us about some of it?
Absolutely. Well, one of the great things about writing a book set in this milieu is that you can sit around watching a lot of movies and call that research. So there was a fair amount of that, but one of the things that I feel like writers often think of research in archaeological terms, that it's about unearthing and excavating. And I've usually thought of it more in map making terms. Like I feel like research for me is kind of how the books end up getting structured. So for instance, when I was working on this, I came across this small little anecdote about big blocks, like 2-ton blocks of ice, being shipped from Lake Erie across the country and then shipped overseas to Asia. And it just seemed like such a bizarre and fantastical, just little historical nugget, the idea of, literally sending these blocks of ice across a desert, and then across an ocean. And so something like that, I knew that at some point I wanted in some way to include that in the novel. And so then, like, as a writer, you're thinking, how can I create a book in such a way that the dimensions allow for this to exist within it?
Yeah.
And so, like, research for me is, you're reading memoirs and histories, and you're chatting to people, and you're, trying to visit these places. But the ultimate goal of it, I think, is not simply to, like, add a bit of, historical color, but it's really to figure out the shape of what you're working with in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you go to movie lots and, like, look at them? Because I know that you've lived in LA and your wife is from there. Did you talk your way onto movie lots for research?
So one of the kind of, like, unfortunate things about LA is how little of the past still exists. So now, like, the backlots in most of the studios are used primarily for tourism.
Wow.
for Universal, studios, their backlots. There is still obviously a lot of production being done at these places, but sort of the glory days of the big film factory has largely gone away, and now most Hollywood studios are in some parts producing selling movies that other smaller production companies have created. But I did try to get as close as I could to sort of this vanished past.
Were you a movie buff before you started writing this, or did one cause the other?
I always did. When I was a kid, I feel like in the summertime, just going and spending the whole day at the movies was just the best thing. My parents are big believers in staying in being the last people to leave a movie theater. So when I was, whenever I would go to see the movies with them when I was a kid, we would always wait until the very last credit rolled. And so the idea of there being all of these individuals who's never enjoy the limelight and who's come 200 names down.
Is that why they wanted to stay, to be respectful to the gaffers and the best boys who come at the very end, or what was their rationale?
It was they wanted to see where everything was filmed.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, and that usually comes after all of the production credits. Come through.
I mean, they were kind of ahead of their time, because now I feel like there are little Easter eggs, there's little stingers at the end of the credits to reward the people who sit and stay through all the credits. So your parents are kind of ahead of their time in that way.
That's so true. It's really interesting. I'm thinking of the Marvel movies.
Yes, that's exactly what I was thinking.
And just how over the course of our lifetimes, it used to be that I feel like fiction drew so much from film in terms of how it structured scenes, and Dostoevsky, reads nothing like fiction written just a couple decades later after the advent of film. Whereas, just in the last couple decades, I feel like film has really been drawing from the vocabulary and the sort of general milieu of fiction, and in terms of creating these multi-series.
Oh, that's so interesting. I hadn't thought about that
sort of thing.
Yeah, in the sense, I think that goes back to what you were saying before about what you call the grace notes, that you'll see a little character and they'll recur later, and you get the sense, oh, they're part of this world. I mean, that's something that I feel like Marvel does. We see it in, TV shows as well. There'll be a little recurrence that you won't notice unless you're sort of one of the fans who's been paying attention, but you're rewarded for that. There's the sense of a wholeness of the world. I feel like if your book were a movie, there would be famous actors who would be clamoring to play all the little roles in there. There'd be these super meaty little roles of these characters that could be sort of, just walk-ons, essentially, in the film world. They're given such a round treatment. They're given their own moments to shine. I'm thinking there's a moment in the book where a night watchman goes onto the set and he sees Maria is working on something, and it's a big moment for the reader because we know what she's doing. She's having this sort of very emotional moment, and for the night watchman who sees her, he's like, oh, okay, and he stays and he gets a little moment of his own, and there's something so beautiful about that dignity of him getting to be a whole person in that moment.
Thank you. Yeah. I kind of I love the idea of writing books that have no minor characters.
Yeah.
Where kind of every character, no matter how seemingly inconsequential, gets their sentence or two in the spotlight. And I think it's a way in part of just reminding the reader that kind of everyone is the star of their own show, and just because the novel centers certain characters doesn't mean that the stories of these, other individuals whose paths they cross aren't as consequential and significant in their own way.
Yeah.
And I think it's like particularly fun to play with that in a setting where you literally have bit players.
Yeah, and if I'm remembering right, Bit Players was another of the titles
It
that you were
was,
thinking
yes.
about, right? Yeah.
There were so many titles. I asked you. I can't even imagine. I can't even remember how many titles
I think there was a point where you came and you had a list, and your wife had already struck some off, and you had struck some off, and you were like, okay, which ones of these do you hate, and then what do we have left? We'll see what it is. But I think you hit on a good title in the end.
Thank you. I'm pleased with it.
I feel like it's on the book now, so it's a little too
late.
I mean,
what can I say? It's.
So I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but I want to remind the people who are viewing that you can ask Anthony Marra questions. Just go ahead and put them into the question box, and I'll pull them up and ask them. And if you all are shy, I'll just keep asking questions. But please do, because I'm sure that he would be very happy to answer them. So one sort of big thing that I wanted to talk about was that I think one theme that runs through this book and then connects it to your previous two books is this sort of larger question about what the role of art and beauty and kind of joy is, especially in the face of fascism or of authoritarianism. Again, that's not a question.
Yeah, no, it's something that clearly runs through everything I've written. I think that that maybe one way of thinking about it is so one of the themes that I think I constantly return to is how history is distorted by political actors in the present. In Constellation, there was a historian who was constantly revising his history of Chechnya in order to satisfy the political mandates of the particular moment. In Tsar, pretty much every story dealt with that question in one form or another. And in this, it's in Mercury Pictures Presents, it's explored through film propaganda. And I think that one of the reasons I return to this idea again and again is because historical fiction as a form often traffics in nostalgia, which is something that I really try to actively write against. And I think that an important part of engaging with historical fiction as a form for me is examining how and why history becomes fictionalized in the political sphere in the first place. And so I think that these characters are often caught in a struggle to recover some understanding of both history and their present reality in a world subsumed by fiction. And I mean, I guess it's one of those things where, like, I think that that as writers, we often maybe valorize the idea of telling stories as a good unto itself, whereas, like any medium of persuasion, it can be used for good or bad. And I've always been interested in how that tension exists and reconciles itself with characters who are sort of caught between these fantasies and reality.
Yeah, and that feels really relevant to now, even though, of course, the novel is taking place around World War II. That question of how we are rewriting the stories of what happened in the past, or we are we're retelling how this goes, or even that we're erasing certain parts of the past and we're just hoping to write over it with something else. There was a really interesting book that I remember you telling me about in one of our sort of library meetups. I want to say it's called The Commissar Disappears or something like that.
Yeah,
it was about
The Commissar Vanishes.
Talk about that. The Commissar Vanishes, yeah. Which is you. I don't know if you want to talk about that, but it's so relevant.
It's this fantastic photo book that had a big influence on the Tsar of Love and Techno. It's the author's, his last name is King. I can't remember his first name, but he was he designed record covers, and I think he might have done one by Jimi Hendrix. Like, he was a very well-known record designer. But in his spare time, he collected censored Soviet photographs and paintings, and he has this really incredible collection of these images where you see sort of Stalin and his henchmen, and in each successive photograph, one more disappears until it's just Stalin.
It's sort of like early photoshopped out of the picture, right? Like they were just never there.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of like one of so we think of like airbrushing as being this, like, quintessentially modern tool, but it was actually first like emerged in a wide scale way during that period.
Yeah. And it feels again so relevant to sort of this book, which is talking about propaganda and the sort of stories that are sort of pushed forward to sort of overwrite other stories that maybe other people would not prefer to have told.
Yeah. I mean, I think that every every work of historic fiction is written primarily, or is written at least, describes the period in which it's written at least as much as it describes the period in which it's set. I think that's certainly the case for Mercury Pictures Presents. One of the things that I kind of most love about fiction is that sense of being transported somewhere that's far from your daily life, that nonetheless speaks to your daily life in a deep way. And that's certainly what I tried to do with this one.
Yeah. All right, we have some questions. I'm going to ask you some of the questions. Casey would like to know. They say, I'm a classics professor, and I remember thinking when reading A Constellation of Vital Phenomena that perhaps you've been influenced in some way or another by ancient Greek literature. Any chance I'm right about that? I can't remember what specifically made me wonder. But so as we're talking again about, like you're saying, like the work that you're writing is related to the period you're in, as well as maybe the past.
Yeah, I mean, so I wish that I that I was better educated in
just
the classics.
Yes, just say yeah.
Yes, definitely. I read Homer every night. No, I think I think that we're all deeply influenced by the classics in the sense that they sort of gave us that they gave us in working in the Western tradition kind of the tools that we are using as dramatists and fiction writers and poets sort of ever since. But I guess I would say that one of the things I remember David Simon of the Wire once saying that his characters existed in a world, in sort of a Greek world, in which tragedy came in the Greek rather than the Shakespearean form.
That's interesting.
Yeah, where it was sort of all about, it wasn't about individuals making tragic choices, but rather being caught in this sort of web of tragic fate.
Yeah.
And I think that is definitely the case for a lot of my characters, that they are sort of in these situations that they can't control, and they are kind of at the whims of what the gods throw at them. And much of the tragedy, I think, has maybe less to do with what they choose than what other people have chosen for them.
Yeah, and the circumstances that they're in. That's such an interesting idea. All right, we've got a couple questions about process, if that's okay to ask about.
Absolutely.
So Dure wants to know, can you talk a little about your writing process? Do you write every day, certain number of hours, words, outline first? How long did writing this book take, etc.? So basically tell us how to do it.
So this book took forever.
I was going to ask you about that, and then I realized it might be rude. With no judgment, it took a long time.
Yeah, so I began. So both Constellation and Tsar took around 2 years each, and so I began working on Mercury Pictures Presents in 2014, and so I fully anticipated to be finished before Obama left office, and it didn't quite work out really it ended up being sort of 5 years of researching and writing and kind of not I'm a big believer that it all goes in the pot, and it's like you need to write your way towards the book that you're meant to be writing, and that was certainly the case with this, where I began with the idea for the book in the beginning was very different from how it ended up at the end. But in terms of just like practical advice, I when I was writing, I would try to write every day if I was able. I'm a big believer in record keeping. So when I was working, I used to keep like a word count log. And on the days when, and my goal was to do 1,000 words a day. And on the days when I got 1,000 words, I would mark it down in black pen. And on the days when I didn't get to 1,000 words, I would mark it down in red pen.
So it's like a ledger of accountability.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm finally putting that Catholic guilt to good use.
It's got to be good for something.
Yeah.
Follow up on this, I think Deborah would like to know, how many times did you revise the novel completely?
Well, so I would say that it took me so long just to get to like a first draft that I was happy with, that it ended up, I think there was maybe like 3 major, like, first to last page revisions after that. But individual chapters. So whenever, and Celeste, you already know this. I'm sure I've told you this at some point, but whenever I'm stuck, I just retype what I already have.
Every time you say that, I kind of get like palpitations. I'm going, oh God.
Well, because it's a way of feeling productive. You look and you're like, wow, I wrote 1,000 words today. They were the same words I wrote yesterday, but.
But when you do that though, do you find yourself changing as you go on? Do you find yourself?
Yeah, I think that you change little things here or there. It's like the voice maybe becomes a little more refined, and I think it forces you to read your work so slowly that you eventually just end up sort of modulating the tone and the general tenor of the piece. So yeah, I would definitely recommend it. Maybe not to you, Celeste, but to Deborah.
Do you, when you do that, are there times that you find that you get to a scene and you go, oh no, this is not right, and you head off in a new direction? Or do you find it affirming when you go? I mean, this is purely my curiosity.
No, it's not affirming in the slightest. What's the opposite of affirming? No,
defirming.
Defirming. It is very, very defirming. But I think that that it's almost like by forcing you to confront your mediocrity, it inspires.
I remember reading, I don't remember which writer it was, but some writer on writing about writing said something like they often would go back and look at their past work, and then their motivation would be to fix it, because they thought, oh God, if I get hit by a truck, they're going to think that this was on purpose because I was in such despair over the terrible pages that I had. And that was their motivation to revise and keep going.
I mean, I think you gotta take your inspiration where it comes.
I feel like writers, basically, we get together and we just share the tricks that we use to try and trick ourselves into writing, and somehow it gets done.
It's interesting though. So our mutual friend slash idol, Peter Ho Davies.
Yes.
Love Peter. He is the sweetest and such a beautiful writer. But I remember him just casually once giving like a series of writing tips and ending it by saying, never trust a writer when what was it? He says you can always trust a writer when they say what works for them, but never trust them when they tell you what will work for you.
Oh, that's a very Peter thing to say, which is sort of A, very wise, and B, extremely beautifully put, and C, also like completely true.
Yeah.
I I think that's so true, because I think even the process of writing one book to another has been really different for me. How has it been for you? Do you feel like the process of writing the books has taught you something that you could take forward, or has it been completely different each time?
I would say it's been different each time. I think that I'd love to hear what your experience has been. But I think that sort of with each book, you kind of become, if not a better writer, then a better reader. And so you are maybe a little more critical of your work. Things that you might have let slip in the past, you're no longer quite as willing to accept. And so for me, it's kind of been that I feel like I've just become a much better reader, and that means that the prose itself needs to do more.
Just a nice way, I think, of saying that with each book, you are still trying to grow in each project, right? Like, you are not just coasting and being like, we're at a good plateau. You are trying to take things further. I like that way of thinking about it. Yeah.
What has your experience been?
I feel like each one has been different, but I think the one thing that is true, I mean, I guess it is a little bit like having kids. Each kid is going to be their own completely different self. It's sort of the same, but also like, well, there's this one, and then there's this one completely different. For me, I think one thing that I've learned is I'm learning I think my intuition is getting stronger. And so for me, the process of writing a book is always going down a series of wrong turns, but I can recognize it's a wrong turn a little bit faster. And I can turn around and trace my way back to the main path a little bit like seconds faster.
Yeah.
And then I can, I maybe will make very fewer slightly wrong guesses, like maybe one fewer, right? But in theory, I guess my intuition is getting a little bit stronger each time. And so I guess this is maybe a different way of saying what you were saying. It's sort of, you become a better reader. You start to understand what your work is trying to do on a more sort of basic level. And maybe that helps you get there a little bit faster or make it a little bit truer as you go through. No, it's interesting.
Well, given that it took me 8 years, it's not making anything faster. It's
all right. Well, here's another question from Gabe. Gabe would like to know, aside from the media you were consuming for research at the time of writing, are there any pieces of art or media you specifically remember as being very important during writing the book?
Oh, that's a beautiful question.
I like that.
Yeah, so I would say in part just movies of that era. I intentionally sort of watched many more than I ever had before, and it was kind of initially it was just to try to get a sense of the language and all that at the time, but it ended up being a way of really trying to get at the sort of the sense of humor, particularly among films by sort of exiled and immigrant artists. There's a director who is sort of sadly not very well known today, named Ernst Lubitsch, and he was in the 20s and 30s. He was probably one of the most successful directors in the country. He was a German Jewish immigrant, and he directed these movies that were referred to at the time as champagne comedies. And he was able to. So at the time, there was this very strict sort of censorship code run by what was called the Production Code Administration. And Lubitsch sort of made a game of trying to circumvent it at every opportunity. And it sort of he created these movies that are these like beautiful this beautiful game that he plays with the audience that he trusts you to know what he's hinting at. And because he never explicitly says it, he was able to get around the various censorship prohibitions.
He wasn't saying the words you weren't allowed to say. He was just gesturing towards them.
Exactly.
That's
yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah, and he ended up having like a huge impact on later filmmakers. Billy Wilder had a plaque over his desk that said, "How would Lubitsch do it?" Um, and so he's somebody whose work was really important to me in this. If you haven't checked them out, I would recommend particularly Ninotchka and To Be or Not to Be. Those are both just absolutely brilliant pieces. It's interesting. Like, Celeste, do you find yourself like when you're looking for literary inspiration, like how often do you look away from books to other mediums?
More often than I think I, like if you ask me for something, like, no, not very often, like, no, actually kind of a lot. I think that sometimes there's something about encountering it in a different medium that makes it feel more accessible, like it's more malleable in a way. And so I realized that I think a lot of my influences come in sideways, not just in terms of a different media, so like TV or film, but also things that I would not have expected. I mean, we were talking about the Marvel movies earlier, and I don't know that I can put my finger on how exactly the Marvel movies have influenced any of my work, but the fact that I feel like I have been watching a lot of them in the past few years, stirring up something, right? I feel like you said, I think it all goes into the pot, and you don't always know what's going to sort of spark a connection in the ways that your brain is going to fire in unexpected ways. All right, we've got a couple more questions, so I'm gonna ask them before we run out of time. Okay, here's a question from Dave. Dave says, does the external world of late lead to added challenges or drains to the creative process, added motivation, or something else? This is something we've talked about a bunch in our Zoom writing dates.
Yeah. So for me, I would say that the pandemic was actually was a very fruitful period, and I think in part it's obviously we don't have kids, so I think that if you that it's a totally different ball game when you are at home just with another adult. Then but for me, like this book sort of took off during the pandemic, in part because I was landlocked in an apartment in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and at the time I was living in this ancient apartment on Prescott Street.
Sorry, I remember. Right.
Yeah, it was the one with all the closets.
Yeah, well, you said basically it was like all closets.
It was all closets.
No rooms.
Yeah, there was like 8 closets. It was a 1-bedroom with 8 closets, and so my desk, my office was a closet that I'd wedged a desk into, and in the early months of the pandemic, I would open my closet door and step in and would emerge in Los Angeles or Italy, and I feel like that the fiction's capacity to transport you elsewhere, I think, is one of its most valuable attributes. And during the pandemic, that certainly was something that I increasingly relied on and sort of really tried to throw myself into it. But I at the same time, as we've discussed in the past, just how the craziness of the world today, I feel like, is it almost makes writing feel like not at all unimportant, but when you are holding the world of fiction against a reality, a present moment that is so fraught, it's a difficult or challenging balancing act to try to reconcile those two aspects of your life and worldview.
Yeah, I guess that feeds well into a question from Christy. Christy says, in times past, the politics of showing the truth in fiction touch nerves. And the example they give is The Grapes of Wrath. When published, Steinbeck and his wife received death threats. How do you think an author can approach the truth and make a difference? It's a big question, but I think it touches on what you're saying, which is, we're both writers. We sit in our desk/closets and we make up stories, right? Does art make a difference? How does art make a difference or what are we doing? Are we wasting our lives doing this?
You know, it's such a thorny question, and one that I don't think has an easy answer. You know, I often think that it's like sort of how do you judge what a good life is? Is I think like almost another way of looking at it. At least, you know, if you're involved in the creative arts. And I think one definition of a good life is not making the world worse. And I think that you know, writing that being part of a literary culture that you know, gets people thinking, and that increases you know, awareness of issues that might not otherwise be on people's mind. You know, I think that certainly doesn't make the world worse. I don't know if it makes the world any better, but I think that it's you know, it's a worthwhile thing to do.
Yeah, this reminds me of something that you said in one of our chats when I think I was asking a similar question of like, why am I doing this? Why are we doing this? You know, and you said something about how, you know, surely injecting a little bit of beauty and humanity into a world that is often bad faith is something that's worth doing. And I thought that was such a lovely way of putting it, because there is a sense of, like you said, we hope it makes it better. At least it's not making it worse. And maybe it's asking people to think about ways that it could be better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess that like that. I love that idea of like a fiction. It's like you're creating. You're almost creating alternate histories in a way, and you're sort of at least creating like this space of possibility. And like part of the act of like believing in fiction is believing that the world could be slightly different.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I feel like one of the things it does is it posits the possibility that things do not have to be the way they are, that maybe they were different or they could be different, and holding that space for the possibility of change, I feel like feels like a not small thing to do right now, at least to sort of just hold a spot for that kind of fragile hope to exist. We're running short on time, but I'm going to ask you some of the fun questions. Deirdre would like to know, she says, I look forward to reading your book. Are any of your characters modeled after your family members? And I ask this because I think you have a great answer for this.
Yes, so they definitely are. Particularly so Maria, the main character, she has these three very sort of rambunctious, fatalistic, and gloomy-souled great aunts who are named Mimi, Lala, and Pep, and they are named after and in at least one of them is inspired by my own great aunts, and so. So I'll just tell you about one of them named Mimi, who is the one who is most present in the novel, and she was the last of my great aunts to die. She passed away in 2015 at the age of 98, and she hated every single second of those 98 years. She didn't like her family. She didn't like New Jersey. I mean, she didn't like anything. But she was always very sweet and very proud of me. And when my first book, Constellation, came out, she would drive around on an expired license to the various bookstores in central New Jersey, and she would move all of the copies of my book from the back of the store to the front, and she would, start putting them over James Patterson and she would then just stand around sort of berating people into buying her grandnephew's book. But she had a real personality, and so she's an example of a character that I did write into the novel. I think that for my first two books, I was really trying to sort of remove any kind of autobiographic elements from the work, and I think with this one, I really tried to embrace my family and their wonderful eccentricities and all of that, and really tried to celebrate it.
I love
Even
that.
it.
That's great. All right, last couple of questions are from Stephanie. Stephanie says, this is very nosy, but what are some of the books on the beautiful shelves behind you? And what have some of your faves been this year?
Ooh, good question. So I put those shelves together all by myself. It took a very long time, and I accidentally hit my finger with a hammer. We have, let's see, what do we have? We have some Margaret Atwood, some Zadie Smith.
I was going to say I could see Zadie Smith earlier.
Yeah,
Distinctive.
I'm such a Zadie Smith fan. We have Tommy Orange. We have Ann Patchett. We have some Jennifer Egan. Some of my faves. And right over here we have
Well, it's my book. See, I love this kind of book cousin reunion of getting it. It has been so special to get to talk with you about this book over years now. I mean, this is really, it's such a joy to get to talk with you about this. I remember, you moved to Cambridge and you were like, yeah, I'm kind of stuck. My character's in jail and I don't know how to get him out of jail. And we started meeting at the library and we'd talk through, I think every week we'd discuss the problems that our characters were giving us, like misbehaving children and how we couldn't get them to do what we wanted. And now it's here and it's great. And so thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Tony, for your generosity and for your wonderful work. And this is where I should say, support indie bookstores. If any of you are intrigued, I can vouch for the book. It's great. Click the little green button and buy from Books and Books. Support an indie bookstore.
Thank you. And as I was watching both of you, from behind the scenes, I was thinking, you are our movie stars. You guys are our movie stars. Booksellers, you're the movie stars. So for us, definitely what you do matters a great deal. So please keep doing it. Congratulations on the new novel. We can't wait for Our Missing Hearts. Can't wait for that to happen in October. Thank you to everyone watching. Thanks for supporting us. And it's been lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you
for hosting us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Celeste. And thank you all for tuning in. This has been so much fun. I really appreciate
everybody. It's really great. Get a copy. It's very good. It really is.
Yeah. Okay. Good night.
Good night, everyone.